Hey, everybody, another episode of the Independent Dealer Podcast. Today we have David Parrish with us from JD Power NADA Wholesale Guidebooks, Retail Guidebooks. That's the book I use, and David really has some good information on how to stay current in this ever-changing market because it is volatile. Thanks for being with us today, David.
Thanks for having me. It's my pleasure.
You are listening to the Independent Dealer Podcast with hosts Luke Godwin and Jeff Watson. Thank you so much for tuning in. Let's do this.
All right, David, thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate you being here today on the podcast and helping educate us independent dealers on, what we can expect going forward. I know so many of us are concerned with what is this crazy time going to do to book values? You're obviously very uniquely positioned to speak to this at JD Power and the NADA book stuff. Tell us a little bit, just generally speaking, what are you guys doing, or where do you see this taking kind of book values?
I'm sorry to jump in, Jeff. David, can we compare and contrast what, let's say, 45 days ago, how the books were getting their values mostly compared to what's going on right this second? I think maybe that will be a little better way to look at it.
Yeah, absolutely. So historically, we derive our book values from wholesale market transactions. We have a database and collect millions of transactions going back in time. And historically, we had based our values primarily off of those. But since the auction right now it's quite frankly broken, we've adapted, and we're taking a more prudent approach to our values. We're not necessarily going to be, portraying exactly what we're seeing at the auction place, but what the values should be in a correct market. So we're looking at other things now. Being part of JD Power, we have access to used retail transaction prices, also a ton of asking price information. So we're taking a little bit different approach, trying to put out values as they should be in a functioning environment, not necessarily just showing what's happening in the wholesale market, because wholesale prices currently through last week are down an average of around 14%, and that's just not simply what we're seeing on the retail side of the market. Retail prices have actually held pretty solid, and the dealers that still are able to retail these used vehicles are still doing pretty well. So we're trying to have a more balanced approach to our values.
David, correct me if I'm wrong, but I always thought that NADA book values were based on NADA partners' retail of those units. Is that not the case? And their retail value and the loan that was made on that vehicle, is that not the case?
That is not necessarily the case. We use all of NAAA's auction prices to primarily come up with the algorithms for each of our individual values, whether it be clean retail, clean loan, whatever it might be. So everything is primarily based off of those auction transactions.
Okay, I must have maybe years and years ago that's the way it was. But it's funny that you say that or what the model has seen is that the retail prices are holding pretty strong, and that makes sense to me because maybe the retail prices haven't caught up. But what I have seen is that you're able to buy the wholesale unit where you should have been buying the wholesale unit to make the margins that are expected to be made. Do you see that?
I mean, wholesale prices, there's no doubt about it that they are severely depressed right now. A lot of that has to do with just the physical auctions being closed. I think you have a situation where, for example, through the week of ending April 5th, nationwide, we only recorded just under 15,000 total auction transactions, whereas, typically during this period, 115,000 units. So I think you're seeing a situation where that are taking equals to the wholesale marketplaces are sellers that really need to get rid of them, and then you also have some of these dealers sitting on the sidelines snatching up these great deals because to your point, there is certainly a very large spread between what those are going for currently and then what they're being retailed for. So
yeah, absolutely. I think those dealers with cash are trying to find motivated sellers. And I think really when people start getting scared that this fire sale that some sellers might be doing, maybe the big lease companies, and we could talk more about that, who these people are that are actually cutting cars loose right now. But it's when you guys take the steps to keep it from being an implosion, back in 2008, they were foreclosing on people's properties and then fire selling them just to get 50 cents on the dollar. And that in turn collapses all of the surrounding properties values. So when you guys can be responsible and say, hey, we're not going to follow this trend down a hole. We're not going to let these used car wholesale prices collapse on each other because we're going to start reporting these numbers. And obviously the other book people need to get on board, and that's probably another rabbit hole to go down. But that's going to help it from just collapsing on itself. Who do you see, or what market segments do you see being hurt the most through this? Are there? I mean, everyone talks about kind of the high end luxury cars are the ones that are taking the largest hit, and the lower ones are staying pretty firm. Or do you see any correlation in price point?
Well, actually, typically, if you think about what this time of the year normally looks like, you're seeing a lot of consumers out there that have just been armed with, pretty nice down payments via federal tax refunds. And this is usually the time of the year where we see the strongest used prices, the strongest demand for used vehicles as well. And usually it's the more affordable segments that their prices are the strongest during these points in times, where, consumers and people that have received these tax refunds and are using them as down payments, they're a little bit more sensitive to large purchases. So it makes sense where you see the more affordable segments, something like a mid-sized car, the smaller compact cars, those prices are usually stronger. And that's what we're seeing right now. We're actually seeing that, these mainstream passenger car prices are the softest right now.
David, you can answer this question if you want, and you may not have any knowledge of this, but over the last, month at the auction, what I've seen is that your big conglomerates, CarMax, Carvana, Drive Time, they are not buying cars. Can you speak to what happens when these big segments of the market quit buying? And I think maybe that's causing depression in price. Is that something y'all see, or can you speak to that?
Well, yeah, they're definitely not buying cars, and they're not only not buying cars at the auction, but I know that Carvana and Vroom right now, if you go on and you're somebody trying to sell a car, and you get your offer, they will not your car, buy a car from them. So they've changed their business model, at least here in the show. And more competition in the wholesale marketplace, it just drives prices up. So if you have certain players that usually go in and you're always bidding, aren't buying vehicles, you've just removed a layer, so you're going to see depressed prices through that in and of itself. So
do you know of any other large dealer conglomerates that have backed off to that effect as well, just not those big ones?
I have not personally talked to any of the big ones that have indicated that they've, pulled out, but just through volumes, you can see it's just not there anymore. So, and with the transactions, I can't actually see who's been purchasing the vehicles either. We just see that itself.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And do you see a correlation from the flip side of that? I mean, again, maybe not something you can speak to, but are there certain sellers, that Hertz or Avis or some of these guys that are motivated because they do need to turn those cars back into cash, even at a 10%, reduction?
I can't speak for them, entirely, but I definitely think that you are seeing a little bit of that happening. But from what I understand, especially Enterprise and Hertz and some of the bigger ones, they're pretty well positioned right now, and they're trying to hold on as much as they can and to figure out what's going on. Yeah, nobody's making any knee-jerk reactions right now. So
I think that's key. I heard some people, and I don't think they knew what they were talking about, but how some of these Enterprise and Hertz were dumping cars, but I have not seen that to be the case. So that definitely hadn't. I don't think it's affected the wholesale market like some people claimed it has. That being said, do you think, and you may not know this answer, do you think that these big rental car companies will hold off buying new inventory because of this, and maybe hold their rental units maybe up to 60 or 70,000 miles like we saw back in 2008?
I mean, it's entirely possible, for use history indicator happen. If the situation worse, I think a little too, try to make an educated guess on what they're going to be doing. It seems like things are starting to trend more positively as far as getting the country back up and running, at least in certain sections. So I think that's a pretty positive indicator.
Mm-hmm. So to transition a little bit, David, in your opinion, do you feel like because obviously in my region, the J.D. Power NADA book is pretty strong as far as what the lenders like to see and what we base our prices off. And I know some are regional, and I'm not super educated on all that. But do you think that as a dealer group, there needs to be a call to the book companies to take smarter approaches to valuation, kind of like what you guys are doing? Do you think everyone else is following that model to say, hey, we're not going to let this collapse? Or, hey, no, we're going to let a free market be a free market. And if these prices go down for 6 months and then skyrocket back up,
Yeah, that's a tough one for the other books. But I think our approach is, one of the more out there right now. So I definitely encourage listeners to, check out what we're doing and follow our methodology, because I think ultimately it'll help you be more successful, once things start to turn around. So.
Yeah, I mean, it's absolutely smart. What you guys are doing makes a lot of sense to recognize this is what it is, and a lot of dealers and people want to kind of speculate on, well, more supply means, less demand, which means wholesale prices are going to drop in 6 months because there's going to be so many cars on the market. But what they don't always factor in is there are policy changes. So when you guys decide to do this and be a little more smarter on what the realistic value of a car is, and Manheim Cox decides to follow, and I don't want to say prop up, but maybe, change their algorithm on how they value these cars, it's gonna both, it's gonna not cause kind of a collapse of those prices.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, if we start to see, the wholesale markets come back and volumes going through, and, prices still be as depressed as they are, we are certainly going to re-examine our approach, and we're not going to artificially, prop up values if the market's actually dictating that, a functioning market, that is. What the wholesale market is right now, it's just broken. So we can't portray that in our book values.
That's something. Yeah, that's something I want to talk about real quick about the wholesale market being broken at the auctions. How much do you think it hurts when the auctions aren't actually open, but you still have condition reports? Do you think that, let's say we were on a fully functioning market and auctions decided to go only digital? They may at some point decide to do this or not. What do you think that does to the market compared to what it is currently or what it was?
Well, I think if, they decided to go fully digital, but volumes were there, it was still a healthy environment, dealers that hadn't purchased digital in the past were up to speed, and understand, what that means and how it's different from how they've done things in the past, I don't see any problem with, any kind of values or volume changes, as long as everybody's on board and it is a functioning market and everybody's on the same page. So
what do you think? I mean, it's interesting. I mean, how long have we been doing digital auctions now? I would think it'd be maybe 15 years or pretty close, coming up on 15 years. How long is it going to take that?
Right.
How long is it going to take a dealer to accept that process? It seems like I see more and more dealers say, I'll never buy a car without touching it. And I buy cars all day long without touching them. Can you speak to that, that process and why more dealers hadn't observed it or accepted it?
Well, I think 15 years ago, the technology certainly wasn't there. But now when you think about if you're, buying something digitally online, you can have detailed high resolution pictures. You can have 360-degree camera views. You can even, hear it in running. It's just a really different time. So I think that, now more so than ever, if you're not doing it, you certainly need to be doing it because of, situations like we're in now. It could, potentially put you out of business if you don't hop on board and at least have the capability to do it. The biggest thing, being able to do it if you need to. You don't want to, have to shut down shop completely because you're not up to speed with all of the latest stuff.
So the big hang up I see, and Luke, to address your point from my standpoint, is if I'm going to go out and buy a 60,000 mile Ford Focus, let's say, I don't know, let's just hypothetically say MMR is 10 grand. And unfortunately, the book or my loan value is only 12. MMR and my NADA loan value are only $2,000 away. After I pay fees, transport, and oil change, I got no room to recondition that car. My front end gross is completely gone. So that's my hang up, or at least the rub I feel is the problem when auction value, what is MMR, let's say, if that's what you're buying off of, or wholesale, is so darn close to loan value, I've got no gross.
Well, that's, I
can't afford to recon anything. I got to see it and know exactly the dollar I got to put into that darn thing. I can't have it show up and there be a surprise in the rear end because there's just no margin left.
Yeah, but that's the reason you don't buy that car. You need to look at the cars that the NADA retail value gives you significant space in there, and there's a lot of cars.
So I'd argue there's less and less cars like that because of front end compression, because dealers are willing to take $500 gross on the front end of all this Velocity Motors nonsense.
Well, let's ask David that question, David. And you've seen the run up to this. I mean, in the last 5 to 8 years, when you're seeing the V Auto model come into play, and everybody's they've essentially killed front end gross and worried about back end profit. Can you talk about what the books have seen with this and how it's affecting retail values and the race at the bottom? Can you talk to any of that?
Yeah, I mean, there's certainly been a ton of compression there. You can see it on especially the new side of the market. I mean, new gross is like hardly anything at this point. Mm-hmm. Everybody's making money on F&I. Same thing with used. Used gross is a little bit better, but I mean those margins are compressing with each and every year. So that's certainly something that we have seen happening, and I don't think anything out there is going to change that. It's just the way that the business is turning. So it's something to be aware of.
But couldn't something like this affect that? Because if you've got dealers who were essentially making nothing on the front end, and they were dependent on volume, and all of a sudden they get hit for a couple months where their volume is a third of what it is. I mean, those people aren't going to be able to make it, I would assume, right?
Hey everybody, Jeff here. Sorry to interrupt the interview, but I wanted to make sure everyone knew about the new and improved theindependentdealer.com website. It is the place to find out what is going on with the podcast. Check out all of our episodes on iTunes, our social links. You can also give us your email and we will add you to our mailing list so you are the first one to know about what is coming up, new and exciting here at the podcast. Also check out our video library. You can also ask us questions, find out more about myself and Luke, and see our calendar of events, places we'll be speaking, where you can catch up with us and meet us in person. So theindependentdealer.com. And now back to the interview.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right.
Yeah, but so whose responsibility is that, I guess? That's what I would look at. I'd say is it us? Is it the dealers that are selling the V-Auto philosophy that are low gross, quick turn type dealers that are killing book values? Or is it the book company's responsibility to say, hey, we know these guys, this street data is wrong because they're not making any money. And if we continue to follow this path from a book valuation standpoint, we're going to be the ones helping to crush the used car industry, and put our own consumers out of business. I don't know. I don't think it's your guys' whose responsibility is it? Are we the ones leading us down this hole, or is it the book companies and
Well, the book companies can only go after the book values there, Jeff. I don't think it's their fault. What do you say, David?
Yeah, we're only portraying what's happening in the marketplace. We're, an independent source. And we just try to reflect exactly what's going on.
That's
so it's our fault.
Yeah, it is our fault.
So even if auction values completely dropped for a 12-month period, all these guys were buying the same cars $2 or $3 grand cheaper than they were 6 months ago. These yahoos are still going to bring these cars home and mark them up $500, which will be way below retail value. And they'll try to V-Auto the guy down the street because they want to be the best price within 500 miles.
But you're missing something. That's not going to happen here because there's going to be so much attrition in the dealer side that it'll allow the price to go up on the retail side.
You're assuming that it's going to put some of those V-Auto dealers out of business. That's what you're saying?
Yeah, there's no way around that. So the reason
I don't know.
The reason the race to the bottom is there is because there's so many people selling the same car. So
right.
If you cut out, let's say, a third of those dealers, which very possibly will happen, and people start to realize there's front end gross again, I think it's going to change the market. David, you see anything there?
Yeah, and also to that point, we've seen the last several years used supply coming back to the market in its highest levels ever. This year is going to be kind of even with last year, which is kind of the peak. And then you got to think, automakers have not been producing cars here, and it's going to take them a while to get up to speed again too. So, looking out next year and then the subsequent years, you're going to have even less used supply coming back to the market. So there's not going to be all these people selling the same vehicles because there are going to be even less of them out there. So I think that might ease a little bit as well.
Yeah, that's interesting. And Jeff, you may not remember this, but and I'm not sure how long you don't really buy that many cars, but in 11 and 12, if you look at the amount of cars, used car market for 11 and 12 models, it's almost non-existent. Right. When you talk about Tahoes, Suburbans, and things like this, they quit making them almost. David, what do you see right now with automakers when it comes to making cars? You mentioned it just then, but do you have any real numbers of what production may end up this year? Have they put that out?
They have not yet. That's something that we're still working very closely with the automakers to try to understand how that's going to look. But it's certainly going to have a pretty big effect because you figure they haven't been building cars now for a month. Parts suppliers too haven't been producing the parts, and then we're coming up pretty soon on a model year transition too. So from a government regulatory side, sometimes you can't use the same parts produce this year, next year. So what is all of that going to mean? When is production actually going to get back up to being, whole again, I guess? We don't have the answer necessarily right now, but it's something that we're looking into and monitoring very closely.
What was the production numbers final of last year? Do you know those on the 19 models?
I don't have that number in front of me.
Okay. Jeff, what you got?
No, I was just saying, I don't know what that number is either, but that would be my counter argument to your conversation, Luke, is it only matters if this is a blip. If it's a 1 or 2 month blip, the manufacturers will catch up. The 2022s might be a little bit late coming out, something like that. They'll catch up with the production if the demand's there. Now, if this extends and it's a full-on recession and people are scared like 2008, then yeah, that trickles down to the couple, people aren't buying new, they're buying used, which means there's less off lease, which means there's less trade-ins in a year or 2 or 3 from now. And that's where the grosses can be held, because I can't go replace this 2-year-old Nissan Altima at the auction tomorrow because they're running 50 of them. Right now I can V-auto the crap out of these things because I know I can go pick up 5 more next Friday,
Sure.
But when that wasn't the case back in 2013, 14, yeah, you were holding your grosses because it was much harder. I remember that. I didn't want to cheap sell the car because I know I couldn't replace it.
That's exactly right.
Right now I can. I mean, I would sell my entire lot at a $500 to $700 markup today, because I know I can pick up the majority of these cars at the auction tomorrow for $1,000 or $500 less than what I'm into these. You know what I'm saying? So there's that V-auto model that we run into.
I've seen a lot of no sales at auction, so I'm not sure.
Well, sale because you're trying to steal it, not because you're trying to offer them close to book value. They're only selling stuff because you're trying to get it $2,000 back MMR, right? Those are the no sales I'm seeing. When I offer the real money, these guys are cutting them loose.
Well, but I don't think MMR is the real money right now. Honestly,
but it is.
I don't think so. I think it's 1,015 back of MMR.
But that's exactly what David's saying, is we're trying not to chase the real money down this rabbit hole, right? We're trying to stay, hey, MMR is not following this depressed volume, depressed price. MMR is not going to drop because of the low volume, just like NADA is not going to drop their valuations because of this anomaly. So you might think it's not the real money today, but it is. If that's what they're going to cut it loose for, it's absolutely real. Real is what you can buy it for. But
so David, I guess to wrap up our conversation here, let's
Luke and I will continue to argue about this when you're done. We don't need to tie up your time.
Okay, so I guess give us some really good advice on what dealers can do when we're looking at the books right now, and how to weather this storm that we're in. What's some good advice to stay strong and book wise, so that we can, make the best decisions with our inventory?
Yeah, book wise, I mean, obviously I'm going to pitch our book because of the steps that we're taking to ensure that we're actually reflecting what these vehicles are worth in the marketplace. So just you can keep up to date with everything that we're doing. If you go to our website, nada.com/B2B, we give a pretty good explanation of exactly what we're doing with book values. We're updating with weekly values as well. So we're not just, running a month on end like we have in the past. We're giving weekly updates to try to give a better, accurate, more up-to-date picture of what's going on. And then, just a little piece of advice for the independent dealers right now. I think, just from what I've seen, try to retail as much of your inventory as possible. I wouldn't, be taking a whole lot of stuff to the wholesale market unless you absolutely have to, until that market's back up running as it should be.
Man, that's great advice. Yes, if you don't need to wholesale, if you don't need cash right now, do not take the bath. Try to retail that thing, because you're gonna take a bath if you try to wholesale it right now.
But even if you do need wholesale it off your lot. Take it $2,000 back a book like Luke wants to buy it and sell it to a retail customer.
Yes, that's right. Retail wholesale if you have to.
Retail wholesale, yeah. David, thank you so much for your time, man. What a huge education for me.
Yeah, for sure.
Really appreciate it.
No, thank you guys.
Thank you for joining us today. Hope this episode inspired you to take positive action. Remember to subscribe so you get each episode the day it comes out. And we would love your help spreading the word. Leave us a review and share this podcast with your dealer friends. Dealers helping dealers learn and grow together.